Hello and welcome to Live at Epiphan. It is Thursday at 3 o'clock Eastern, so big surprise. Dan and I are here in the Epiphan studio bringing you this week's topic, which is going to be a really interesting one. Of course, join us every Thursday, and we cover all kinds of different stuff. What are we talking about today?
So today we've got a great episode, so stay tuned in because we're going to be talking all about live streaming bit rates and demystifying all of the math, all of the bandwidth issues, everything you might need to know about how to set your live streaming bitrate and what bitrate is to begin with. So stay tuned in. We're going to get into that topic in a moment. But first, as always, if you are watching on Facebook or YouTube, give us the old like, support the show, subscribe if you haven't already. That way you'll get all the updates of when our new show begins and all of our content is coming out. Also, you can follow us on Twitter. Send us an email to live@epiphan.com. We want to interact with you guys. We want to know what you'd like us to talk about here on the show. So, jump into the conversation, say hello and chat, and we'd be happy to take your questions live during the show as well. So before we get to the topic, I know you had a couple updates you wanted to fill us in on.
Yeah, so before we dive too deep, we usually start off every show talking about any updates we might have done in our studio space. They might be subtle to the average viewer, but we did make some pretty important updates to the studio this week. We have a completely new green screen behind us, and it made lighting it a lot easier, a lot flatter, which is a significant thing, and the little intricacies of green screen is a whole other topic, but that's been a big improvement. Changing some of our lighting to have more color-matched consistency, which just helps with balancing everything out. So that's some stuff, and any of us who joined right away, you may have noticed that we had a little intro jingle. Getting fancy. So that's an experiment we're running to see, how that might change a few of the ways that we do this show, and as examples of some of the many things that you can do when you're playing with live streaming. So those are the quick updates. Let's jump into the topic. So what do we have with this demystifying bit rates?
Yes. So why don't we start at the very beginning? We're talking about video compression. And that's what bitrate is all about. So maybe, George, we can sort of talk about, first of all, what is bitrate to begin with? My understanding of bitrate is that it's a way to sort of measure the amount of data that your video stream is using over time.
Yeah.
Is that sort of correct?
That's how we represent it in terms of you will see megabit per second or kilobit per second. So, yeah, it's definitely fair in terms of the way we measure it. Its effect is, as you mentioned, compression. How much of that overall data we're squeezing. And we're going to go into a lot of details about it a little later on. But essentially, yes, we have this chunk of data and we need to get it somewhere. How much of that can we move in a given amount of time? And normally that's by second is what we talk about. And that can have a lot of impacts, and we're going to cover all those, of course.
So let me ask, what is the measurement standard that we measure bitrate in?
Usually it's in megabits per second.
Okay.
It's the most common way you see it represented. The alternative to that would be in kilobits per second. The nice part there is you're really only talking about a certain number of digits different in most ways it's represented, and then either a K or an M on the end kind of thing.
Okay.
So megabit per second is a good way to look at it because when you're talking to an internet service provider, that's usually the number they're going to tell you. And so that's a good reference point to get an understanding of what you can do. And again, we're going to look at some of those things. For example, later on, we'll talk about speed tests. That a speed test is going to typically reference megabit per second.
Okay.
So that's a good place to start.
So megabits per second is the sort of fairly universal measurement of video bit rate and compression.
I think it's the most common way people say it.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at equipment settings, even our own equipment with Epiphan, whether it's the X2 or Pearl 2 or things like that, the settings will typically reference kilobit per second.
Okay.
Like I said, it's a pretty easy translation between them. And when we look at some of our details, I think you have some cool screenshots.
Why don't we pull this up here on the screen? So I was just sort of doing a little bit of research about bit rates and decided to see what Netflix uses. Everyone knows Netflix. They're obviously compressing a ton of video, streaming a ton of video all over the world. And they have some sort of standard guidelines that they have for how much bit rate is required for different resolutions of video. So this chart kind of shows that. And if you go down to the bottom of the chart, they're telling us that for them, their standard bit rate for a 1920 by 1080 video file is 5,800, but that's in kilobits per second, correct?
Right. So really what you're talking about there is just under 6 megabits, 5.8 megabits roughly. I mean, there's a few variations to that, but again, so it's an easy conversion to do.
So it's just you just multiply by 100, 5.8 megabits per second, add two zeros.
Exactly. It's pretty straightforward to figure that out. So the translation between them is not difficult. And you can see even on this chart that they have a couple of different brackets.
I'll just move the chart over so people can see it there. That's a little better.
Yeah, there we go.
Whoops.
So at 1080, for example, they might go potentially as low as 4 megabit at 4300K. So anyway, there's a lot of details there. The resolution column there is really interesting because that's part of this equation and definitely a big part of what we're going to be talking about today. Resolution, of course, is not the bit rate, although sometimes people unfamiliar in this space do get a little bit confused by resolution versus in terms of compression and all these other things. There's a lot of acronyms that are going to get thrown around today, a lot of stuff. So hopefully, if you have any questions or if you get lost or confused, throw it in chat.
Ask in chat if you have any questions.
We'll try to be more clear. The problem is when you work with this stuff day in and day out, you kind of just don't think about it in normal terms anymore. It just becomes as
well. Let's try to put it into real terms that people can understand if you're unfamiliar with bitrate. So my understanding is that when watching a video stream, a higher bitrate will result in a higher quality of video. It's going to look better. It's going to require more data. It's going to require a better connection. But a higher bitrate encoding is typically going to look better.
Absolutely, and as a general rule of thumb, that is absolutely true. As even these Netflix numbers were suggesting, that if you're doing something like full HD, 1080p, you're going to want something quite a bit higher than what you would do at 720p. And that's a quality difference.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's arguments to be made about whether or not you want 720 or 1080 as a general resolution, which is a pixel by pixel measurement. And we have some good examples of that to show you why you would choose something and why you can't just take 1080 and compress it down to a tiny, tiny bit rate and expect that to be effective. Because there's a lot of considerations there. It's the image quality you're going to get, and how that represents the content you're putting out there.
Sure.
There's certain content that absolutely is unacceptable at a really bad bit rate, and there's some that's okay. So you have to look at that and decide what's going to fit the content that you're producing.
Why don't we sort of look at some examples here? Let's take a look at some video examples so that we can actually see some different bit rates. Once again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to jump in the chat. We're actually monitoring it here on our laptops, so we can answer your questions live here, and we want to have that interaction with you. So I've got some examples here. So there's this great open source film called Tears of Steel. It's a Creative Commons film, so we're allowed to show it here on the show. We're not infringing any copyright, and we can also demonstrate some examples of different bit rates. So
perfect.
I'm actually going to play a clip here, and this is just to sort of explain. This is a full quality 4K
40 megabit.
40 megabit.
So
clip.
That's Blu-ray quality in terms of encoding.
This is like reference quality. So when the movie studio creates their file that gets put onto a DVD or sent out to a variety of different content delivery networks, this is the reference quality of the film. So I'm going to play it. Obviously, you're seeing it through YouTube, so there's some compression happening on your end. But this
Compression on compression?
Yeah, a copy of a copy. But this should represent sort of what typically we'd know as like a high quality video compression. Now I'm going to play this. Clip's about 30 seconds long, so we'll just check it out.
So generally, it looks very clean, what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I mean...
There's not a lot going on at the moment. It's very clean.
Looks very clean, very crisp. Detail is excellent.
Lighting and shading all looks good. That looks fantastic in that stage. The colors and everything. So now you got a lot more action. Still looks good.
Yeah, so when the robots come in, there's lots of action, there's explosions and gunfire, and everything looks awesome.
Yeah. That's what I would expect if I'm watching a Blu-ray in my home theater.
Yeah, that's a 40 megabit clip. Now let's play the same exact clip, but let's dial our bit rate down. Let's actually dial it way down. We're going to go with half a megabit. So 0.5 of a megabit. This is now a 1920 by 1080 full HD clip playing at half a megabit.
So 500 kilobit.
500.
Right away, there's a massive difference in quality. I mean, I can barely tell this guy has eyes because of the pixels, huge blocky compression artifacting. There's frame dropping. There's all kinds of things. You can't make out any of the green foliage there. I don't know if that's a robot or just a smear on the screen.
It also seems like it just feels choppy. It doesn't feel
Absolutely.
as smooth as it did previously.
And that can happen for a number of reasons. When you're compressing video, especially for live streaming, and you're compressing on the fly, the hardware has to keep up with that, right? You're literally taking data and squeezing it, right? That takes processing power. And sometimes squeezing it too much is actually harder than not squeezing it at all.
Gotcha.
So somewhere in all of this, I think the big takeaway today is somewhere in amongst all this information we're going to throw at you, there is a balance between image quality that's going to give you the content you want, not wasting bandwidth, and just getting it out there in an effective way. So there's a lot of things you need to look at. Now, obviously, if I was trying to watch this movie at 500K, to me, that's unwatchable. I'd be clicking away from that so fast, I'd be out of there. Like when Netflix does that to me because my internet provider's not giving me a very good speed at that moment, I'm done. I'm going to go do something else. Because
there's a certain point where it's unwatchable. And actually, I was looking on Netflix. They have a really great tech blog, believe it or not. And they actually have a measurement that they use, a signal-to-noise ratio measurement, where they actually look at the compression artifacting and the color banding and all of those sort of low bitrate encoding problems that crop up, and they measure that to determine what's acceptable, which quality standards are acceptable. Like, just to give you another example, I'll just play the same clip just for the hell of it at 0.19 megabit. So this is showing you, like, when you squeeze that image down, I mean, it can't even play smoothly. It's pretty terrible.
Ugly, and it's really ugly. And that reflects on, the content producer. If you're producing content that has this amount of pixelization and compression artifacting, it reflects poorly on the content provider. If I was watching a live stream and that's what it looked like, I would just think, okay, these guys don't know what they're doing, because it's just not a professional look. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, back in the late 90s when, streaming long before YouTube, things like that were happening and everyone was on dial-up, you fully expected, mud. But we're past that now. So there's a lot of things to definitely consider there. Signal-to-noise ratio is a good one to look at, because depending on the type of content, you can get away with more compression in some cases. So a still image, let's say you're giving a PowerPoint presentation, you can get away with compressing a still image slide like a PowerPoint much, much more than you can an action movie. An action movie where there's a lot of lighting, shading, movement.
The camera is doing this.
That represents a worst case scenario. Mm-hmm. That is the absolute worst case scenario.
So as I understand it, the way that video compression technology works is pixels that remain the same require less data.
Exactly.
Because the pixel hasn't changed. So
we don't need to re-encode it.
If you have a pixel that is a white pixel and that part of the image doesn't move or change, it just basically is telling the compression, okay, don't touch this pixel anymore and leave it. But if lots of pixels are changing, there's a lot more data required to inform all of those changing pixels. And actually, the higher the resolution you have, the more pixels there are in your image, right? So like a 1080 stream has almost 2 million pixels, 1920 times 1080.
Right, 720, it's half that, a little less than half that. And the main thing to consider here is when you're looking at resolutions, as I kind of touched on a little bit, you're talking about a pixel by pixel measurement of a display, essentially. Every pixel equates to data that we have to compress or transfer or transmit. And so we have to look at how effectively we're doing that. And again, if in our compression codecs we can avoid recompressing things, doing extra work where our image is mostly static, things like that, then we can get away with a lower bit rate. But if it's worst case scenario, let's say 1080p with 2 million pixels involved, and it's an action movie, you're not going to get away with compressing that very much. You're going to have to find a higher bit rate in order to effectively show that content without it looking like garbage.
Yeah, exactly. I have another interesting example just to show here very quickly. We were talking about the number of pixels and how that can affect it. So if you take a look here, this is just a freeze frame of that reference. So this is the reference, the 4K 40 megabits. So this is essentially perfect quality. Now I'm going to click to the next slide. Now we're looking at HD, so 1920 full HD, 1080p, and this is at half a megabit. So you see,
there's no definition.
It's pretty terrible.
You can just see like the edge of his face is just blocky and chunky, right? It's just there's no. Yeah.
I can't see his eyes at all. It all
right.
Looks. You can see a whole bunch of pixels are combined into one, and
exactly, and that's shading. That's all these lighting effects that don't compress well, at low bit rates. So, yeah, that's a great example.
Let's look at the next shot though. So this is half a megabit at 1080p.
Okay.
But let's look at the next slide. So this is again going to be half a megabit, but this time this is at 720p, and it's interesting, George. Maybe you can explain this, but when I go to this 720p, I'll just click back for a second. So here's the 1080 again at half a megabit. And here's the 720. So this is a lower resolution at half a megabit, but it actually looks better.
Right. And that's because there's less pixels for us to compress. So now there's a whole other topic of, which resolution should you be using. When it comes to live streaming, we have to look at the platform. So as a prime example, Facebook Live, which hopefully a bunch of you are watching us right now on Facebook, only supports 720p live streaming at the moment. And that's, as we've covered in other shows, the primary reason for that at the moment is the majority of viewers are using a mobile device. And even though a lot of mobile devices technically have a screen resolution higher than 720, you can't tell the difference. Because at that point, on a 5.5-inch, 6-inch screen, the human eye just doesn't see the pixels that small. So 720 on a 5.5-inch screen is very acceptable. If you're dealing with a 65-inch television, that's when things like 4K start being important, because you're going to be sitting in a certain proximity. And so there's a whole other science to resolution for distance of the viewing and the size of the display. It's not really related to bit rate. That's a whole other scientific topic. But needless to say, if you're streaming on Facebook or even on YouTube and the majority of your viewers are going to be using a small display, a laptop or a phone or a tablet, trying to stream at a high resolution isn't going to give you much value. So if we can chop the resolution down a little bit, sacrifice that a little bit, then we can go at a lower bit rate and have the same effective image quality as a higher resolution at a higher bit rate.
Very interesting.
If that makes sense.
I think it makes sense is that, a lower bit rate does not necessarily mean lower quality
Right.
depending on the resolution.
Yeah.
So
there's
you
a-
can
there's a
compensate
relationship.
for a lower bit rate by reducing your resolution to some degree.
Absolutely. I mean, you can easily get away with, at 720p, you can cut your bitrate in half and have the same effective image quality as you did at a higher resolution. So, you'll see that on any streaming device. Definitely with our Webcaster X2, there's a variety of settings for the bitrate.
Actually, if you want to pull this up here, I've got a video bitrate. So this is actually from the settings menu on the Webcaster X2, and this is showing the bitrate. So this is in kilobits,
Yep.
but if we wanted to convert it, we just drop 100.
Yeah, it's
Right, so
1 meg, 2 meg, 3 meg, 4 meg, essentially.
yeah. So 4 megabit being HD quality is what, at least for YouTube, is acceptable. Correct?
Yeah, exactly. For 1080, that would be an acceptable resolution and something within what YouTube would expect. Facebook, because it's only at 720, can accept up to 4 megabit, but in many cases, 4 megabit at 720 is great if you can do it, but you don't have to. You could actually do it at 2, and most of the time, except in extreme circumstances, you may not notice a massive difference. But you just cut your bandwidth requirement in half.
Yes. Okay. So let's talk about bandwidth a little bit. So, choosing your bitrate. Why does bitrate matter for live streaming? Perhaps more than video on demand or other things. We're obviously talking about bitrate, and bitrate is relevant across all delivery formats of video. But why for live streaming is bitrate particularly important?
Well, the main reason why it's important is as a content producer, when you're talking about live streaming, your main concern is your upload, the pipe that you have to send data to the internet. As a viewer for video on demand, Netflix, things like that, your primary concern is download, bringing data down from the internet. These are two completely different values, and in many cases, in most places in the world, your upload and your download speeds of an internet connection are not synchronous. They're asynchronous in many, many places, especially on a home connection. Business connections are more typically synchronous. So we have to know what our upload speed is in any given scenario. The tricky part is that when you are being quoted a speed from an internet provider, they're going to quote you the higher number because that's what makes them, from a marketing perspective, look better. And you can't blame anyone for that. That's just marketing, right? So they're typically going to give you the download speed.
So when I actually just got a new internet service provider recently, and they were quoting me different prices for different quality of connection, and it would be like a 25 megabit connection or a 5 megabit connection, which I thought was not nearly enough. I like to do a lot of downloading.
Yep.
But when they say 25 megabit, they're explaining to me my download speed, right? Because they figure I'm going to be watching Netflix, I'm going to be cruising Facebook, I'm going to be doing all these things.
Right. And it's a bigger number, and I mean, in the world of consumerism, the bigger number sells.
Yeah.
Right? So,
but they don't even seem to really enjoy talking about upload speed at all, right?
No, and that's because you have to dive into their tech specs, right? So in many cases, here in Canada at least, in the US it's a little bit different, in other places in the world it'll be vastly different. But here in Canada at least, sometimes the difference between a down and an up speed is huge. Like you could get a 25 meg down, you might only have 5 meg up.
That's not very much.
You might get 10, it depends on the provider, things like that. But you have to look, you have to know. Because if you bought that 25 meg package thinking that it was synchronous, and then you went and tried to do a live stream at 20 meg, pretty much guarantee it's not going to work.
Now, just to give an example, I remember at one point I had a cable internet connection, which I thought was great. My download speeds were pretty decent. I could stream video, no problem, HD video. But then when I went to try to upload my video onto YouTube, I was really struggling. Like, it would take so long to do my upload. So I looked into it and I realized that my cable internet connection only had a 1 megabit upload speed, which is one megabit even enough to do live streaming?
Realistically, no, unless you're doing an absolutely very low resolution. I mean, we're talking 640 by 480, standard definition from, days gone by kind of thing, right? If you're talking about HD, even at 720, realistically, you're not going to be very effective live streaming at below 1 megabit. Now, you said you had one up. Well, that means you can't use it all because there's always variable, right? The bit rate, the upload bandwidth you have available on your connection is never constant. It's always going to vary a little bit. There's going to be peaks and valleys. And so, you need to know what it actually is, not what's quoted on paper, but find out for sure what it is. And you can do that by running a speed test. Now, there's a lot of ways of running a speed test, and I'm sure that's what you did to discover that that's all you had.
Yeah, well, why don't we try right now?
Sure.
Showing, so if I'm going to be starting my live streaming
just walked into
show,
your venue.
I just walked into a venue where maybe I want to do a live stream. I go to Google. This is what you showed me. I go to Google. I type speed test in my Google search.
Yeah. Google will give you a speed test right as the
Okay,
first
well,
hit.
let's do a speed test right now.
You click a speed test, and it's going to first do a download test, and this is going to tell you, hopefully, exactly what you're paying for.
Yeah.
Now, ours is going to be a little bit skewed because here in our studio, we're on a separated VLAN with a chunk of our overall bandwidth dedicated. But anyway, the numbers will be fair. So we did a download test, and we're running at 15 meg. Pretty good for a down, not bad. Did an upload test. We're just shy of 25 meg up. That gives us quite a bit of headroom to do pretty much anything shy of 4K live streaming. 1080, no problem. 720, we could do that multiple times on that. I'm not quite going to get to 4K unless we're running at a low 4K bit rate. But we've run this. If we ran this 2 or 3 times, I bet you we would get 2 or 3 different results because there's always variation, as I said. So we need to know what that is and, of course, run it multiple times, take our average, and then start doing the math.
That's how you know what you've got to work with,
Exactly.
right?
That's the size of the pipe.
That's the size of the pipe. That's going to determine what kind of bit rate you're even capable of utilizing. And actually, we've got a great infographic on our blog on the Epiphan website. I'll pull it up here. But this is, if you go to our website and check out our blog, you can find all of this. And I'll put a link to this in the notes as well. But this is, a really nice way of just sort of doing some very simple math to determine how much bandwidth you have and how to determine what bit rate you might be able to use. So I'm going to put a link for everyone to that in the show notes and in chat. But check out our website because we've got some very basic graphics to sort of help you wrap your head around all of this.
So the quick math there, you can do it in either direction, right? You can look at your encoder and what its bitrate setting is. So we looked at Webcaster earlier. That screenshot, it was set to 2 meg, right? So we can take that number, we can do this math 1.5 times, and then we know what our realistic minimum upload speed needs to be to accommodate a 2 megabit bitrate. Same time, we could work backwards and say we've done a speed test. We have 5 megabit. We know that we can run 2 meg on that. No problem.
No problem. How much headroom do you need? I mean, if you wanted to do a 5 megabit upload quality, stream quality, how much extra bandwidth might you need in that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, this math of 1.5, like we mentioned in the blog, is a pretty fair number, in my opinion, as a minimum to start with. And the reason I say that is I'm a tech support guy, and I don't like getting upset phone calls. So when I look at that, you got to play it safe to a certain degree, knowing there's going to be variation, knowing that in some cases you might be in a venue where it's a shared connection. And if it's a shared connection, then someone else could be jumping on and occupying a chunk of that bandwidth. You can't run at 90% or 100% of your availability all the time. It doesn't make sense.
Just to give you an example, George, when we were down at Infocom in Orlando recently, there's 40,000 people on the show floor.
Yeah.
So when you test your connection during the setup day, the day before, and we're testing our upload bandwidth, pretty good.
Yeah.
You get there on the day with 40,000 other people using their phones and other devices that they have connected to the network.
Yeah.
That that bandwidth starts to become much less reliable.
Exactly.
The spikes, there's peaks and valleys in how much.
Right.
So you want to, I suppose, compensate for that by using perhaps a lower bit rate than what you may think to plan for the worst bandwidth that might come up.
Right. So so doing frequent tests to confirm that what you originally thought was safe is still true is a good rule of thumb, and just making sure that it is a fair test, that it is an active test, during a worst case scenario, because you want to make sure you're playing for the end. So I mean, I think that covers a lot of it. In terms of recommendations for settings, that's probably one of the biggest questions that we get when we're talking about our equipment. For the sake of time, we can look at 1080p and 720p. Webcaster's great at making some good recommendations for those because it only has a limited set, and they're good recommendations. At 1080p, 4 megabit is a good place to start. If you have extremely complex, very detailed content like an action movie, you might want to be at somewhere between 6 to 12. And the reason I say that is because YouTube in particular could do 1080 at 60 FPS. If you're jumping frame rates, kind of getting a little off topic there, but if you're doubling your frame rate, you need to double your bit rate. So if you're at 60 FPS, what you might be able to do at 30, you need to double it.
Gotcha.
Facebook, 720 at 30 is all they do. So anywhere from, 1 megabit for a very simple, primarily static shot, maybe some guy standing in a podium or a slide presentation is great. But if it's something more complex, you're going to want to be at the top end, and they support a maximum of 4 megabit, so crank it all the way up if you have the bandwidth to do so.
That's good information. Now, if you have questions, throw them in chat right now because we're checking it, and we want to answer any questions you have. But before we round out this topic, I want to ask, maybe, George, you could provide us with some tips. So
sure.
Let's say that you get into a venue where you wanted to do a live stream, and the connection maybe isn't the best. Maybe you've only got... You do your speed test, maybe you're getting an upload speed of 7 megabit. So there's not too much extra room. You want to plan for the worst. Mm-hmm. Maybe you only have 5 megabit or 4 megabit, but you need this live stream to work. Yeah. What tips would you have in those sort of scenarios? What can you do to ensure that your stream doesn't have terrible quality or that your stream doesn't drop because it doesn't have enough bandwidth?
So for me, if I was in a venue and I had 7 megabit as an upload, and I've tested this multiple times, 3-time verification across a couple days that's what I'm consistently getting, I probably still would not exceed somewhere between 4 and 5 megabit. If I'm using something like Webcaster, I know I'm safe to use its maximum at 4, crank it up, leave it at that. If I'm getting 5, then I'm going to go, okay, well, there's going to be some variation here. I probably can't safely do 4, because if it dips just a little or it gets shared just enough, I might start tripping over other data. So I might set it at 2. I realize that's...
And what would happen? Like if your bandwidth takes a big dip, will the stream drop? Like what might actually happen?
It can, and it will depend on the platform that you're using. YouTube is quite good at compensating for data loss. It'll recover itself pretty well. Facebook is pretty good at it as well, but you'll get chunks of data missing or dropouts. Some platforms, the stream may die altogether, and you'll just lose everything. So it can be a very, very serious issue. But just like an inferior image quality can reflect poorly on a content producer, so can stream interruptions. So you want to make sure that you're going to have a nice, smooth, consistent, and sometimes that means making some sacrifices.
Is there any tips at the location? Like one thing that I was thinking is, Wi-Fi tends to be less reliable than a wired connection. So perhaps it might make more sense to use a wired connection.
Absolutely.
Rather than the Wi-Fi in your venue.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime, if you're doing live streaming, any time, you have the possibility of using wired Ethernet over Wi-Fi.
And on the Webcaster, we actually have both, right? You've got
exactly.
your antenna to do Wi-Fi. That's always there for you if you need it. But we do have a dedicated Ethernet port as well.
Anytime you can go hardwired, do it.
It's
And I can't really emphasize that enough, because it is going to be your reliable option. Wi-Fi, it has any number of reliability issues, from crosstalk, interference. I mean, someone could turn on a microwave and it could cut your Wi-Fi bandwidth in half, right? There's all kinds of weird things that can happen with Wi-Fi. It's a radio signal. All kinds of interference can happen. So anytime you have the possibility of using a wired connection, that's going to be your ultimate reliable path. So do that. Double, triple, quadruple check your bandwidth over time. Test, absolutely, to make sure.
Now, I actually have a tip as well that I can kind of demonstrate here as well. So if you have a lower bandwidth connection, there's some production considerations that you could use as well. So just like we showed before in the clip with the action movie, when all of that, when the robots are flying in through the window and the gunfire and the explosions, it really strains the encoding, just like we mentioned, because there's a lot of changing pixels. So what you can do to compensate for that is ensure that your camera is locked off, not moving, right? Because less stuff moving in your video image. Perhaps try to use a very plain background, kind of like what we're using here, which is sort of part of the reason why we use a very simple background behind us here in the studio, is that we don't want to have all kinds of motion behind us, because it's going to strain. We're going to be using our data to move these pixels, but we want the data in our encoding to be focused on making sure George and I look great. And actually, I'll pull up an
struggle.
True. So I'll pull up an example here. Here's just every 10 seconds, we're going to add a little more to this clip. So this clip is encoded at 3 megabit. And you see here, it's constantly 3 megabit. It's looking pretty all right. It's got a plain gray background and the quality looks somewhat decent. Now, as we add like a motion background, it's hard to notice right now, but the quality does take a slight dip.
Still looks pretty good
on my face. Looks okay. Let's add more. Let's add a lower third with some motion in it.
So as that was sliding in, I did see a little bit of compression artifact.
A little stutter.
A little bit there.
The quality on my skin is not quite as good. Now we're going to add...
The stripes are starting to
get we got the flames now. Yeah, this is looking quite, more moving pixels, and the quality of my image is going down. More flames. Okay. Yeah. Now you see it's really starting to take a hit. There's a lot of pixelation around my hand. There's different
skin
compression.
Tones are starting to blur. Yeah, it's getting chunky.
Let's keep this going. We're going to add, just for fun, we're going to add some snow here in a moment. Oh, there's the snow. Now you see the quality of the 3 megabit encoding just isn't enough for all of that motion and moving pixels.
And pause it there, right? You're really going to see, while you were in motion, when you just paused this here, you can't tell you're wearing a striped shirt anymore, where in the beginning you could. Again, we're losing the definition and shadows around eyes and skin tones. All that stuff starts to just block up.
And I'll just to compare, so I'm just going to skip back to the beginning again. So this is with the plain background. So this is all 3 megabit. This is all the same data compression rate. So you see the quality here at there's a good freeze frame. You see the quality. This is acceptable quality at 3 megabit because Absolutely. I have a plain background.
Simple.
Once I add the snow and the flames in the lower third, the 3 megabit really starts to fall apart. It's just not enough for all of that motion and movement.
Yeah. So the takeaway from that sample is being considerate of what your content is. So we wanted to take a look at a few questions. We've got quite a few questions coming in. One of the first ones I'm going to look at here, is there an economic way to stream video to Facebook in Honduras? Well, economic from a equipment purchase point of view, Webcaster X2, that's an easy one. What you can do in terms of internet in Honduras, honestly, I have no idea. Speed test is your friend. Hit speed tests and see what you get, and then kind of make a determination from there, as we've been talking. Someone else was asking, they joined a little late, is the relation between resolution and bitrate? We talked a lot about that at the beginning, and yes, absolutely there can be. You're not going to realistically do 1080p at half a megabit or even really 1 megabit. That's just going to look like mud. Like that example we looked at 1080 at 3, That's borderline, depending on the type of content you're doing. So something like 4 megabit is a good starting point for 1080. But if you can drop down to 720, if you can do that, scale down to 720, then you can go to 2 megabit, even 1 megabit and get away.
And
with
you know, I gotta say, like, so many people are watching YouTube and Facebook on their devices now. We talked about it before. I mean,
Yeah.
I think what was it? Something like 60% of all YouTube is watched on a mobile device anyway.
Yep.
So on a mobile device, most people's screens aren't 1080p anyway.
Right, doesn't matter.
They might be 720p, and at 5 inches, the 1080p really is not always necessary. So if you are struggling with a lower bandwidth upload speed, just drop your resolution to 720p. You're going to be able to reduce your bitrate and still get a better quality of video stream.
So we did have one other question here related to mobile, so it's a great one. What about using mobile internet for upload? You can. Previous episodes, we even demonstrated doing exactly that with a webcaster, Wi-Fi tethered to a phone, and doing that. The same rule applies. Speed test, speed test, speed test. I recently, this past weekend actually, had a chance to go to one of the other locations in Ottawa here where I had ideally wanted to run a mobile live stream using a webcaster. It's in Gatineau Park, and I finally got a chance to get up there on my motorcycle, and the first thing I did when I arrived, take my phone out of my pocket, take a picture, and then run a speed test. And what I discovered was, even on 4G, I cannot do a quality live stream from that location. My phone will say I have 4G, meaning I'm connected to a 4G network. That does not mean I'm getting good speed. If you look over your cell signal bars, which most of us equate to a phone call quality when we're looking at those bars, that's a pretty good indicator. I was getting barely 2 bars where I was, which meant I was getting about 700K for an upload. Less than 1 meg, not realistically going to do any sort of HD streaming. So again, a speed test told me that. I rode 10 minutes in another direction to a different park on the Ottawa River, did a speed test again, I was getting 10 megabit. So it's all about, mobile can be very tricky. You definitely have to maybe even triple down on your speed tests.
And Ryan's asking in chat, he just wants to know if the recommendations that you gave regarding bitrate apply the same on mobile to wired internet.
I mean, for the most part, yes, with the caveat that mobile is more susceptible to variation, and that's purely, the same way Wi-Fi is. You're more subject to interference. We were talking about Infocom. If you have 40,000 people all using their cell phones in a trade show, there is so much interference going on that your speeds are going to be all over the place. So it's going to be very difficult. You can go super technical into cellular bonding to make sure that you're covering as many networks as possible to try and filter through those interference, as well as hopefully load balancing between multiple networks. But that's why, again, at the end of the day, if I can get a wired Ethernet from the venue and plug it in, I know I'm not going to be dealing with those. So it's absolutely possible. You just have to be more conscious, and you might have to do your math a little different. If you feel like you're getting consistently 5 megabit, you still are probably not going to want to exceed 2 in your bit rate, just to make sure that you have enough headroom to work with it.
So if the signal takes a little hit, if too many people are on the network, you can absorb that. You've got enough headroom. So I think that pretty much rounds out bitrate. If you have any more questions, please, of course, throw them in the chat. We're happy to answer them. But let's move on to some of our news that we want to cover on this episode. So why don't you start things off?
Yeah, Webcaster is on sale now. We've talked about it for a number of episodes now. Webcaster X2, second generation social media streaming device. It's on sale now at epiphan.com and through some of our partners. Definitely check that out. It's a very economic way of getting social media going. And if you feel lucky, then we also have a contest.
Yeah, so we actually, until the 27th, we're having a contest where you watching right now, can win a Webcaster X2. We're going to be giving one away to one lucky person. All you have to do is go to our website. You can find the contest links on there. I'm actually going to throw it in chat right now for all of our friends. I can't throw it in the YouTube chat, so I'm going to throw it in the Facebook chat right now. So there you go. But we'll also put a link to the Webcaster X2 in the video description once the live stream ends on YouTube, so that you can find it. But you can also find it on our website. So if you want to win a Webcaster X2, there's 8 ways you can enter, and the contest will be running until July 27th. So yeah, do check it out, and
somebody lucky.
Hopefully you'll have a chance of winning.
So as Dan mentioned, any suggestions or questions you guys have, send it to an email, live@epiphan.com. Throw it into chat. We're happy to get back to you on that. Next week, we have another topic that's not too dissimilar from what we're talking about, kind of taking it to another level. And that'll be 10 tips for Facebook broadcasting. So just optimal ways to make that happen, and make sure that it is as smooth as possible and as high quality as possible.
Excellent. And as always, we're going to be here in the Epiphan studio live every single Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We want to interact with you. We want to know what you want to learn on this show. So send us an email, live@epiphan.com. If you have a show idea, send it to us. We'll do it. We are always looking for ideas to talk about. So please don't hesitate to give us your feedback. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's how you're going to find all of our content. We have our live show streams on YouTube and Facebook, like we said. So give us a like on Facebook. You'll get the notification right on your phone when we go live. And yeah, just tune in every Thursday, 3 o'clock Eastern Time. We'll be here, and we'd love to chat with you guys. So
thank you for joining us on our longest show ever.
Yeah, this was a long show, but I hope we answered all of your questions, and that we gave you a nice summary of bitrate. There's a lot to learn here, but we're always here to answer your questions. So even after we end the show, don't hesitate to send us an email, live@epiphan.com. And I think that's it. So until next week, I'm Dan.
I'm George.
So long.